Somewhere between 50,000 and 2 million years ago, depending on which scientist you ask, a human being opened their mouth and said something that meant something. Not a grunt of pain, not a cry of alarm. Something more specific than that. A sound that carried an idea from one mind into another, and the person on the receiving end understood it. That moment didn't make headlines, there was nobody around to write it down, but it was arguably the most consequential thing that has ever happened on this planet. Because everything that came after, every conversation, every story, every law, every song, every argument, every declaration of love, every scientific discovery communicated to another person, all of it traces back to that first exchange. The question is what it was. That's how, what did they say? What were the first things human beings actually talked about? And buried inside that question is a smaller one that might be even more interesting. What was the first word? Let's start with what language actually is, because most people think about it backwards. We tend to think of language as something that was invented to communicate information, facts, directions, warnings. And yes, language does all of that, but some researchers argue that's not why it evolved in the first place. British anthropologist Robin Dunbar has spent decades studying the relationship between brain size, social group size, and communication across primates. And his conclusion is striking. Language didn't evolve primarily to share information. It evolved to manage relationships. Dunbar's argument goes like this. As early human groups got larger, the old primate method of social bonding, physical grooming, picking through each other's fur, became impossible to scale. You can only groom one person at a time, but you can talk to 3 or 4 people simultaneously. Vocal grooming, as he calls it, allowed humans to maintain social bonds with far more individuals than any other primate. Language, in this view, was essentially gossip technology. The first conversations weren't about hunting strategies or the stars. They were about people. Who did what to whom, who can be trusted, who broke the rules, who is sleeping with who, which means the first subject in human history was probably other humans. Think about what that means for a second. The most ancient conversational impulse, the one that language may have literally evolved to serve, is the same thing people do on social media today. Sharing information about other people's behavior, reputation, and social status. We didn't invent gossip as a guilty pleasure. We invented language partly to make gossip possible. But let's go even deeper. Before sentences, before grammar, before anything we'd recognize as language, there were sounds. And some of those sounds almost certainly carried meaning long before they became words. This is where the question of the first word gets genuinely strange and fascinating. There's a theory in linguistics called sound symbolism, and it proposes that certain sounds carry inherent meaning that doesn't need to be learned. Not all words, but some. There's a famous experiment where people are shown 2 shapes, one jagged and spiky, one smooth and rounded, and asked which one is called kiki and which one is called booba. Across cultures, across languages, across age groups, the overwhelming majority of people say the same thing. The spiky shape is kiki, the rounded shape is booba. Nobody told them that. The sounds themselves seem to carry a quality that matches the shape. Researchers have found similar patterns with other sound meaning pairings. Small things tend to have words with high front vowels across many unrelated languages. The E sound in words like teeny, petite, klein. Large things tend to have low back vowel sounds. Enormous, grand, grows. This isn't coincidence. There seems to be something in the human auditory and motor system that creates loose but real connections between certain sounds and certain qualities of experience, which means the very first proto-words might not have been arbitrary at all. They might have emerged from the body itself, from the shape your mouth makes when you're expressing heat versus cold, danger versus safety, near versus far. The first words might have been less like labels and more like physical expressions of experience, sounds that felt like what they meant. And if that's true, the candidates for the first word become very specific. The word mama, or something phonetically close to it, appears in an extraordinary number of unrelated languages. It's not a coincidence of borrowing or shared ancestry. It's deeper than that. Linguist Roman Jacobson studied this pattern extensively and proposed that mama may be one of the most ancient sounds in human language because it emerges naturally from the act of nursing. A baby suckling and vocalizing at the same time produces a nasal M sound. The word for mother, in dozens of language families with no historical connection to each other, is built around that same nasal M. Mama, mère, madre, mine, mutter, mama, ama. The first word might not have been invented at all. It might have been discovered, accidentally, by an infant, and repeated until it meant something. Similarly, universal is some version of the sound for no, a sharp, abrupt sound, short, closed, unambiguous. Researchers studying early child language development have noticed that children across all cultures produce rejection sounds before almost any other communicative act. The no comes early because the need it serves is ancient. Danger, stop, wrong, get away. These were survival-level communications that couldn't wait for sophisticated grammar to develop. So if we're honest about the first words, they were probably something like mother, no, mine, there, hot, come. Not poetry, but functional in the most fundamental sense possible. Now let's talk about what the first real conversations were probably about. Full exchanges, one person communicating something, another responding. Because this is where it gets interesting. The evidence we have, both from archaeology and from studying modern hunter-gatherer groups, points pretty clearly to a handful of topics that dominated early human conversation. And the first, the one that almost every researcher agrees on, was food, not food in the abstract. Specific food, where it was, how much of it there was, whether it was still there, whether it was safe. The cognitive demands of finding and sharing information about food resources are enormous, and language would have provided an immediate, extraordinary advantage to any group that could do it. Imagine being able to say, even crudely, across the river, 2 days, many deer. That's not just communication. That's the difference between your group surviving the winter and not. But food wasn't just practical information. It was social currency. Who shared what with whom, who contributed, and who didn't. Fairness around food distribution appears to be one of the oldest and most powerful social concerns in hunter-gatherer societies. Anthropologists studying these groups consistently find that violations of food-sharing norms are among the most common sources of conflict, and conflict naturally requires communication to navigate. So the first extended conversations were probably about food, where it is, how to get more of it, and whether someone is getting more than their share. Closely behind food came danger, the communication of threats, predators, hostile groups, environmental hazards. This category of conversation would have been extremely high value from an evolutionary standpoint. A group that could communicate danger accurately and quickly, that could say not just a predator, but big predator. That direction, moving fast, would survive at a significantly higher rate. Early language would have been under enormous selective pressure to develop precision around threat communication. And then, supporting Dunbar's theory, came people. Specifically, the behavior, reliability, and character of other people in the group. This is where early conversation starts to look recognizable. Who can be trusted to share food when things are scarce? Who is a reliable hunting partner? Who has shown bad judgment? Who has done something that benefits or threatens the group? This kind of reputational tracking was essential social infrastructure. In a small group with no laws, no courts, no police, reputation was everything. It was how cooperation was enforced, and language made it possible to build and maintain reputational records across the whole group. Gossip, in other words, was not a frivolous addition to early human communication. It was load-bearing. It held the social structure together. There's one more category that the evidence points to, and it's the one that feels most distinctly human. Story. Specifically stories about things that weren't happening right now. Displacement is the linguistic term for talking about things that are absent. Not present, past, future, hypothetical, distant. Most animal communication systems can't do this. A bee's waggle dance communicates the location of flowers, but it can't tell other bees about flowers that existed last week. A vervet monkey's alarm calls are specific to different predators, but they can't discuss a predator that might come tomorrow. Displacement is uniquely, profoundly human. And it was almost certainly one of the earliest things that made human language different from every other communication system on Earth. The moment a human being said something equivalent to yesterday, near the big tree, I saw a lion, the world changed. Because now experience could be transferred. One person's encounter with danger could protect people who weren't there. One person's discovery of a food source could benefit the whole group even weeks later. Knowledge became cumulative. It could outlast the individual who acquired it. And from displacement, it's a short step to imagination. If you can talk about what happened yesterday, you can talk about what might happen tomorrow. If you can describe a lion you saw last week, you can describe a lion that doesn't exist. You can exaggerate it, make it bigger, give it meaning, turn it into a story that teaches something, warns something, explains something. The first stories were probably indistinguishable from the first lies, and both were indistinguishable from the first art. So what did early humans first talk about? They talked about their mothers, their hunger, and their fear. They talked about the person in the group who wasn't pulling their weight. They talked about where the animals were. They talked about what happened yesterday and worried out loud about tomorrow. They talked, in other words, about exactly what we still talk about. The words got more complicated. The grammar got more sophisticated. The topics expanded to cover everything from quantum physics to heartbreak to the plot of a TV show. But underneath all of it, the same ancient impulses are still running. Feed me. Protect me. Tell me who I can trust. Tell me what happened. Tell me a story that makes this all make sense. We've been having the same conversation for 300,000 years. Why just keep finding new ways to say it?